Yeah. So moving on to the next animated film, the Berserk animated movies, the Golden Age arc movies. I watched all three of them, and I have very mixed feelings about them. Speaking of like
these are the movies I was talking about that I thought you meant when you were talking about the real Berserk, by the way. I like the new Berserk. That's what I thought you were talking about.
Yeah. So speaking of scaling, if I had to scale them all together, they would be a 6 probably. The 6 is, it's okay. It's whatever. But individually, I would say the first one is a 6. The second one is a 7, maybe 8. The last one is a 6.5 potentially. So I would say the second one is probably like 7.5, and the first one is a solid just 6. The reason I say that is because the first one, I was like, it was okay. Like that's what the 6 is for me. 6 is okay. It wasn't the best. It wasn't the worst. The 3D animation feels so unnecessary all the time in that movie. Like when it comes to a bunch of soldiers fighting in the background, make those 3D. Of course, it's a bunch of soldiers. You don't want to have to hand animate all of those. It makes sense. But for the people in the foreground fighting,
better than me. I would have just done stick figures.
But the people in the foreground fighting, I feel like should have been the ones that were 2D animated, while the background fighters were 3D animated. Or like soldiers that don't matter, those could be 3D animated. Another thing about the animation is that there were times where characters weren't moving and they were 3D models. And I was like, why don't you just, they're literally not moving. Now, I'm not trying to make it seem like animation is easy by any means. And I'm pretty sure the reason this movie is in CG is because it had tons of constraints. And that's why they did things in CG to make up for those constraints. But, let's pretend like they could have had more money. They could have had more time. I felt like the characters that were main characters that were standing completely still and right up in front of the screen, still being 3D models is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Because it's like, bro, they're literally not moving. You don't need them to be 3D model. Draw that, bro. And they also cut out a lot because it's a movie instead of a show. I feel like the first movie and the second movie needed an extra 30 minutes at least. Because there was like content that had guts, spoiler alert, getting to know the Band of the Hawk that was completely cut. So he kind of just has this random, like there's a time skip, but even in between that, they still show him getting to know them. So it feels like he just randomly is like good friends with them. And you also just don't get to learn about them. You don't really get to learn and build a relationship with the Band of the Hawk. So in the last movie, when again, spoiler alert, the eclipse happens and they all die, it's like, it's messed up, but you didn't really feel connected to them. Also, whenever they do a flashback to a very, very, very crucial part of a character's backstory, it's blurry and the camera is doing this the whole time. I lied to you not. The camera shakes and it's blurry the entire time. It's really weird. Like these are important backstories to these characters. And the camera just shakes and it's blurry and it's clearly being animated. And they just decided to shake the camera. It's weird. That's for the first movie. Again, okay. Now the reason the second movie is rated the highest is because like the last 30 minutes of that movie is so good. The animation quality like jumps so high up. They essentially do mostly 2D. And it's let me just make it doubly clear. At this point, I'm spoiling things. It's a scene where Griffith is having sex with the princess. And he Guts had just left. Actually, before that happened, the animation was great. When he was fighting Guts, when Guts was trying to leave, and he was like, if you're gonna leave, the same rules apply as the first time. You have to beat me in a fight. And Guts was like, bet. And the animation in that very short fight was great. The fight goes goes by very quickly. It's just a simple, they both swing their sword. He tries to parry Guts' blade. Guts is too big and strong, and he just breaks the sword. And Guts stops the blade right before it cuts him in half. And then Griffith falls to his knees, and he's like, damn, I lost. And that whole scene was animated beautifully. And I'm watching, I was like, why wasn't this the whole movie? Why wasn't this 30 minutes the entirety of the movie? Because it was so good. That's why that one's rated so much higher. The last movie, when it came to the eclipse, the coloration was really weird until like the demons really started to come out and kill people. Then it turned red because at first it was kind of like this grayish, bluish purple, which looked really dull. And then it turned like this reddish purple. And I was like, okay, now it's colored properly. It was really weird. That was a weird choice. Also, because because immediately after watching that third movie, I went and read the volume to see like, okay, how does this compare? Because I was like, I swear that the God Hand did not talk as much as they did because they kept talking in this movie. And I was like, why is the God Hand talking so much? They're so much less intimidating when they continuously talk and move around and do weird stuff. I'm like, shut up, stop speaking. Just sit there menacingly in the background looking creepy like you did in the manga and in the older show. Because they're taking away from their intimidation factor when they're being, one of them was being kind of a little bit too goofy. He already looked goofy. But having him move around so much was just weird. So yeah, that's how I feel about those movies. I feel like 3D animation, in some cases, was just weird. We've talked about 3D animation before. I like 3D animation when it's done really well, like Dorohedoro, Beastars, even Demon Slayer. They use 3D animation specifically for the background. I'm not saying they should do that for Berserk because Berserk having these beautifully painted and drawn backgrounds is like a part of just its allure. So I'm glad they actually did that in this movie. But when it comes to CG characters, the idea behind it is that you want to try and mimic 2D animation. So you turn down the frame rate to like 2 frames per second, 12 frames per second. They animate in twos. And you try to make them look like they're cell shaded and things like that. But these models just weren't good. So when you sat them next to an actual 2D person, it was so clear that they were 3D. And it was weird. And that's why I say when they zoomed in on characters and the characters were barely moving, it should have been 2D. Just to, wrap this up. Essentially, at the end of the day, we still don't really have nothing's perfect. So, at least a really good Berserk anime adaptation. Because I love the 97 anime, but it's honestly dated. It's a little old. Even though it came out a year after Cowboy Bebop. Cowboy Bebop's animation is far better than the 97 Berserks. There are just some cases where the animation isn't as fluid as it should be. And I feel like if, that same studio did it today, they could probably do it much better. And the 26 anime is just straight up not good. I would not recommend it to anyone. It also cuts an entire arc. My dude. It's weird. And this one right here, the only reason I would recommend this one is because the 97 anime cannot be found on streaming services. Maybe illegally, I would suggest that, but it's
completely legal streaming services.
Cannot be found on any streaming service. But I think you could get it on DVD if you really want to watch it. That's the only reason I would suggest these movies, because you literally can't find anyone else. If you like reading, I would just say read it, because that's the best way to consume the story, only because there isn't a really good anime out yet. That's all I have to say about that. You say you saw them. You say you liked them.
I mean, the movies weren't bad. That's why I was confused when you were talking like mad smack about Berserk, like the new stuff, and I was like, I thought you were talking about the movies. You were talking about the show. I didn't even know the show existed, like the new show. I didn't know the new show existed. I was like, what? Like, I don't see what you're talking about. And like now, I was like, okay, we're not talking about the same thing. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's okay. Like I said, 6 overall. 6.
I can agree with that.